Okay, so we may begin. This is the opening on the second day of our academy. Yesterday, after the welcoming addresses, we visited together the archives and the library of the Istituto Sturzo. It was an exciting experience, I think, really interesting, and a sort of new evidence of the good framework in which we are trying to work. This second day is devoted to two keynote lectures. I have to thank very much the two keynote speakers who kindly accepted our invitation, and beginning with Professor Kaiser. I know he is connected from remote. I don't know if it is possible to see him, but I am sure that he is able to hear us. Only a few words of introduction of Professor Kaiser. Of course, there is no need for many of us to give much information, but I know that there are people connected from remote, so it may be useful to give some news about his academic profile. Professor Kaiser is Professor of European Studies at the University of Portsmouth and is visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. So it is clear from the beginning that the scientific research interests of Wolfram Kaiser are about history and politics of Europe and European history and European Union in particular. Professor Kaiser has published many books, he has been author or co-author, and he has edited or co-edited many other books. I would like only to mention his first monograph, that is the book about Using Europe, Abusing the Europeans, Britain and European Integration. Then a classic work about Christian democracy and the origins of European Union, and many others. The last one, it is the European Ambition, the group of the European People's Party and European Integration, and we ask them today to speak about this subject. So the title of his lecture is Forging European Union, the European People's Party Group in the European Parliament during the Cold War. So the floor is to Professor Kaiser. Thank you very much again. Sorry, this is Professor
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Renato. Can you all hear me? I don't think it's so essential that you can see me, but it's essential that you can hear me. Yeah? Can you just confirm that this is working?
No, we may hear you. Probably the volume may be lowered a little bit.
Okay. Is this better now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, good. Well, thank you. If there are any technical issues, then please let me know and we can sort that out. I think thank you very much, Renato, for this very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here, although I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in this wonderful hall in the Istituto Sturzo in Rome. But nevertheless, I hope that I will contribute something that you may find useful in terms of your overall discussion, our overall discussion at the CIVITAS Academy. Now, as Renato Moro has already said, I'm going to talk about Forging European Union, the European People's Party group in the European Parliament during the time of the Cold War. After 1945, the Christian Democrats advocated European integration as one of their core ideological and programmatic tenets. They strongly influenced many core features, of course, of the present-day European Union. They did so not just through intergovernmental bargaining, but also via their transnational party cooperation, as I've tried to show in my book, which Renate's just mentioned, which was published in 2007. In 2052-3, the European Coal and Steel Community's Common Assembly for the first time constituted a formal institutional platform for the more exclusive cooperation among the Christian democratic parties from its 6 founding member states. They formed the largest common transnationally constituted parliamentary group alongside those of the Socialists and Liberals. In 1958, they remained the largest group by a significant margin in the Integrated Parliamentary Assembly of the European Economic Community, which renamed itself the European Parliament in 1962. In 1976, finally, the Christian Democratic Group renamed itself the European People's Party, EPP Group. I will just refer to the group, independent of which period I'm going to talk to as the group in my presentation. Drawing on my much longer contribution to the co-authored book about the group published in 2020, which Renato has also just mentioned, in this keynote lecture, I will address some key elements of the joint political action of the group in the EEC into the 1980s before its transformation into the European Union in the Maastricht Treaty, when the European Parliament acquired legislative co-decision powers. In the first section of my lecture, I will discuss the group's changing composition and internal governance over time. I will then explore the group's European ambitions for shaping 2 crucial functions of the EP, system building and policy making, in the second and third sections. During the Cold War, the group's greatest contribution to European integration was arguably its consistent approach to system building based on its broadly federalist agenda and quite united approach to making the EC-EU institutions both more efficient and more democratic. The latter primarily by working towards a significant strengthening of the EP's role and powers broadly in line with the national template of parliamentary democracy. In contrast, regarding socio-economic policy issues, the group was generally much more heterogeneous than the socialists. I will illustrate this with examples of some policy areas. On this basis, I would seek to draw out some larger questions of continuity and discontinuity across the first direct elections in 1979. In doing so, the conclusion also pinpoints some of the group's core structural and policy challenges that continue to inform its later parliamentary organization and actions after the end of the Cold War. On composition and governance, the group was constituted of its MEPs from 6 member states until 1973, 7 of 9 member states until 1981, and 8 of 10 member states until 1986. Until 1973 and again from 1992 until 2009, the group had members from all EC-EU states. Its percentage of MEPs and its internal composition by nationality changed significantly during the 35 years until the EC's transformation into the EU. In 1958, the group had 67 of 142 delegated MEPs, with 38 socialists and 35 liberals. By 1968, the group was marginally down to 65 MEPs. Between the 1973 Northern enlargement and the 1979 EP direct elections, it only had 52 of 189 MEPs, with the socialists on 66. The group's relative decline was due in large measure to the electoral decline of Christian democratic parties as in the Benelux countries, and the fact that it had no MEPs from the United Kingdom and Denmark. The EPP parties did well in the first direct elections in 1979, however. They ended up with 107 MEPs of 410, only marginally behind the socialists on 113. Throughout the 1980s, the gap with the socialists widened significantly again. In 1984, the group won 110 of 434 seats, and in 1989, 121 of 518 seats. In 1989, this constituted only 23% compared to the socialists' 35% of all seats. Compared to the composition of the EP generally, the broader patterns of policy making in the EC, the group was characterized by 2 key features which impacted directly on its internal dynamics. The first concerned the law representation of French parties, which resulted from the Fifth Republic majoritarian voting system, the decline and subsequent dissolution of the MRP in the 1960s, and the shifting party organization and transnational allegiances in the center of French politics. In 1968, for example, only 2 of 65 members of the group were from France. In 1989, 6 of 81 elected French MEPs joined the group. This constituted just 5% of its total of 121 MEPs. Franco-German bilateralism heavily dominated intergovernmental relations and bargaining in the EC, however. The low French representation and influence meant that the group could do very little to support Franco-German coordination at governmental level. And this was especially true while the German CDU-CSU was out of power at the federal level between 1969 and 1982. The second key feature was the strong representation of the Italian DC. This was only in part down to its electoral strength. Additionally, the DC profited heavily from the pro-Western centrist party's decision to exclude the neo-fascist as well as the Italian Communist Party and initially the Italian Socialist Party until 1956 from the Italian representation in European parliamentary assemblies. The issue became embroiled in the DC's vociferous internal debate in the 1960s about its opening to the left, and it was only resolved in 1969 after the Italian communists had completed their turn towards Europe and gained nearly 27% of the popular vote in the 1968 Italian elections. In 1968, out of 65 MEPs, 28 still were Italian and only 18 German, 8 Dutch, 6 Belgian, and 3 from Luxembourg, alongside the 2 French members. The internal composition only became normalized after 1969. After the first direct elections, the 42 German CDU-CSU MEPs constituted 40% of the group and the Italians with 30 members, 28%. Against this background, the group initially developed an informal tripartite relationship between the Italian, German, and Benelux groups of MEPs, which strongly influenced its internal governance. The group's working patterns were also characterized by a strong bilateralism between the Germans and Italians, who together formed a numerical majority, which could greatly facilitate internal policy making in the group. This bilateralism became especially pronounced during the long reign of Egon Klepsch as chair of the group from 1977 to 82, and again from 1984 to 92. As early as November 1975, Klepsch wrote to the German CDU leader Helmut Kohl that one should aim to make close informal cooperation between the 2 parties a habit before any group meetings in order to coordinate decision-making. Their shared European integration ideology acted as strong glue that helped the group transcend internal transnational social, political, and cultural divides. They included the latent tensions between Christian trade unionists and MEPs close to industry, and especially the farming lobby, which was extremely well organized within the group and integrated into the policy community that developed and defended the common agricultural policy in the EC. Their shared European ideology also made it easier for the group to ignore the Nazi past of several German members who were in fact at the forefront of propagating federalist solutions for the EC after the war. They included Hans Vorler, who had joined the SA in 1934 and the Nazi Party in 1938 and was EP president from 1960 to 62, and Hans Edgar Jahn, who had become Nazi Party member as early as 1932 before the Nazis took power in 1933. The shared ideological commitment to deeper European integration also made it easier for the Christian Democrats to grapple with the practical problems of intercultural communication. Until the 1973 enlargement, the group mainly used French and German for purposes of internal communication. Despite the low number of MEPs in the group who spoke it as their first language, French was the most important EC language and the first foreign language for most Italian MEPs if they had one. German in turn was spoken by many MEPs from the Benelux countries, in addition to the CDU-CSU members. English only slowly became more important as the main language of internal communication throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The internal composition of the group made it necessary to strike a delicate balance in the allocation of posts. Until the 1980s, this balance was largely reflected the interests of the German, Italian, and Benelux delegations, with some scraps left over for the Irish Fine Gael members after 1973 and the Greek New Democracy MEPs after 1981. Comparing the distribution of the most important posts between the Italians and Germans as the two largest national delegations in the group reveals interesting preferences and career and behavioral patterns. Thus, from 1952 to 1992, the CDU-CSU with Illerhaus, Lücker, and Klepsch held the group chairmanship for 20 out of the 40 years, and the DC with Barbie only 2.5 years during 1982 to 1984. In contrast, the DC had 4 EP presidents, with De Gasperi in 1954 and Pella from De Gasperi's death to 1956, Scalba from 1969 to 1971, and Colombo from 1977 to 79, compared to the 1 for the CDU-CSU by Furla. Until 1977, DC politicians also continuously filled the position of chair of the EP's influential political affairs committee. Italian DC politicians tended to regard the EP as a forum for propagating and fostering their broadly federalist agenda for the EC, hence their interest in the chairmanship of the Political Affairs Committee. They also saw it as a suitable means to gain popularity and legitimacy for a national or European career outside of the EP. Their relatively low attendance in the EP and lack of effectiveness in the group was in part down to the need to participate in the time-consuming internal strife within and between the different correnti, the political factions of the DC, to secure their position within their national party. It also resulted from the particularities of the Italian electoral system that encouraged physical and media presence in the constituency and in Italy. The German members focused more on their EP role, both before and after the direct elections. The likes of Furla, Illerhaus, and Lücker never held ministerial posts in Germany. After 1979, moreover, many German MEPs had a political career in the parliament only. First elected in 1979, for example, Hans-Gerd Pöttering was re-elected as an MEP until 2014. He was group chair from 1999 to 2007 and EP president from 2007 to 2009. This strong continuity, based on a combination of the CDU-CSU's relative electoral stability and EP-centered career path, allowed many German MEPs to develop an excellent understanding of EP politics and extensive networks within the EP and the wider EC-EU institutional system. Despite important long-term continuities, as in the form of close cooperation between the German and Italian delegations in the group, the 1979 direct elections also marked major change in terms of its internal organization and working practices. To begin with, the group roughly doubled in size, and the vast majority of its members already were or soon became exclusively members of the Parliament, the European Parliament. As a result of the end of the dual mandate, they could devote far more time and energy to EC matters in the EP. They also needed to find themselves something useful to do at a time when the EP had substantial budgetary powers already, but no legislative powers at all. Much of the group's and the EP's further increased policy activism after 1979 derived from this internal structural incentive, as well as from the perception of a Eurosclerosis that needed to be overcome. To translate the widespread desire among the EPP MEPs for greater internal cohesion and increased influence in the EP and beyond into practical politics required entrepreneurial leadership, however, that carefully took the group's political and cultural heterogeneity into account. Klepsch, as group chair, especially provided this leadership in the transition from the delegated to the directly elected EP, thus preparing the group for cooperation and competition in the parliament in the fight over positions, influence, and the future of European integration more generally. Moreover, they could now build on a much enlarged and professionalized administrative structure with growing policy competence, something that helped the group and its members to become more independent, both from the EP committee secretariats and from national sources of policy advice. And now talk about the federalist vocation of the group and its focus on deepening European integration. The group's professionalization after 1979 and its strategic focus on its own enlargement and buttressing its role in the European Parliament contributed greatly to making it central to the EP's system-building function. demanding and facilitating the EC's institutional deepening, including endowing the EP with greater budgetary and eventually legislative powers. For the group, the end point of the process of constitutionalizing the EC was a European parliamentary system in which the EP would, grosso modo, have the same powers and fulfill the same functions as national parliaments did in member states. In the prevailing political language at the time, the group supported a dual strategy of combining so-called small steps to enhance the EC's decision-making effectiveness and strengthen the EP's role within the scope of the existing treaties, with demanding substantial treaty reform. The group effectively agreed on such a dual strategy as early as 1972, when it set up an ad hoc working group. It comprised influential MEPs, including the former Commission President Walter Hallstein. Its task was to discuss institutional reform questions in response to the debate that member state governments were now beginning to engage with about creating some form of European Union. In contrast to the policy of small steps, which largely united EP groups, the group played an outstanding role in promoting treaty reform for constitutionalizing the EC. In part, it assumed this role by default, as the socialists were for a long time disunited on the issue of the constitutional future of European integration. At the same time, however, the Christian Democrats had played such a role in the debate about and the practical politics of European integration from the beginning, a role that they cultivated as the core component of their remembrance discourse. The group's habitual references to the post-war political heritage of Schuman, Adenauer, and de Gasperi constituted a distinctly Christian democratic vision of the founding father narrative. The group created a strong vector from post-war party networks and existing constitutional blueprints to the 1952-53 European Political Community Treaty and beyond. Politicians like Taviani, von Brentano, and Pierre-Henri Teitchen, for example, from France, had been highly active in early transnational party cooperation. They shared a broadly Catholic continental vision of reconciliation and European integration. They made sure to introduce many elements into the draft EPC treaty of the constitutional blueprint prepared by another French Christian Democrat, François de Menthon, in 1948 already. The group continued to play the role of federalist engine in European Christian democracy after the creation of the EC. Several prominent group members acted as rapporteurs for key EP reports. Christian Democrats also used the presidency to promote their agenda. Upon being elected as EP president in April 1960, for example, Forla warned, I quote, against overbearing bureaucracies that could develop technocratic lives of their own. Instead, it was essential to hear the heartbeat of politics, as he called it, in European integration. Whereas de Gaulle wanted to hear this heartbeat in national capitals only, the group advocated European-level parliamentarization as the key component of what another group member, Alfred Bertrand, in the mid-1970s termed the Christian Democrat strategy for the EC's, I quote, fundamental democratization. As Umberto Tulli and Daniele Pasquinucci have traced in some detail, the group, the Political Affairs Committee, and the EP in its entirety focused first on making proposals on how to implement the EEC treaty provision for the EP's direct elections. The group promoted the use of a uniform system of proportional representation for these elections to take place on the same day throughout the EC, as would befit a parliament in a federal system. It made a major contribution to the De Hoos report adopted by the parliament in May 1960, which inter alia drew on work by the Dutch Christian Democrat Willem Schult on questions relating to the electoral system of the parliament. The group continued to advocate EC constitutionalization during the debate about European Union in the 1970s. Thus, it largely shaped the EP's 1975 Bertrand report, named after the Belgian rapporteur and group leader during 1975 to 77. In times of strong intergovernmentalism that saw the informal institutionalization of the European Council in 1974, however, the group put somewhat greater emphasis on 2 points for which it expected more support from the Commission and the Council at that time: new EC policies to address transnational challenges like pollution, and increased institutional efficiency to overcome blockages in the Council. Once the EP was directly elected, the group immediately set out to discuss EC reform. Altiero Spinelli soon took the initiative and set up the cross-party Crocodile Club to bring about fundamental constitutional change through creating an ad hoc EP committee to prepare a draft constitution to be ratified by the parliaments of the member states. The Crocodile Club initiative posed a serious challenge for the group in several ways. Ideologically, as one of the founding fathers of European federalism, Spinelli largely shared the group's programmatic preference for constitutionalizing the EC. Nevertheless, although not a party member, he had of course been elected to the EP on the list of the Italian communists, which made it much harder for many Christian Democrats to sell cross-party cooperation with him to their often staunchly anti-communist members, as in countries like Germany. Politically, Spinelli's initiative also threatened to undermine the group's standalone identity in the EP as the strongest promoter of deepening European integration since 1945. Even when the group agreed to make a full contribution to the work of the newly constituted Institutional Affairs Committee charged with drafting the draft treaty on European Union, it remained concerned about its own identity and visibility in the process. Thus, on the day when the Crocodile Club presented EP President Simone Veil with its demands on the 10th of February 1981, the group put out a press statement. It agreed with the thrust of the Crocodile Resolution, but insisted that institutional proposals should continue to be prepared in the Political Affairs Committee, which it had dominated for such a long time. Spinelli took great pains to convince the group to come around to supporting the setting up of a separate committee. In May 1981, he took the quite unusual step to write a formal letter to Klepsch and the group, referring to the Christian Democrats' own narrative about their European roots going back to Schuman, de Gasperi, and Adenauer. Spinelli emphasized the need to treat institutional reform as a cross-party matter. The constitutional question, I quote, gives rise to political divisions which are different from the usual ones, unquote. Developing a new draft treaty would have to be done by the group's top experts in political and institutional affairs in a new institutional setting. Spinelli then had two private conversations with Klepsch, and in the end, Klepsch overruled the internal dissent so that the resolution for European Union was eventually adopted in plenary with full group support by 161 votes to 24 with 12 abstentions in July 1981. In a diplomatic gesture, it explicitly referred to the group's 1979 resolution on European Union. And from then onwards, the group constituted the backbone of parliamentary support for the Spinelli initiative and the draft treaty on European Union. Although the final version of the DTEU marked a constitutional compromise and was never ratified, of course, the process leading up to the EP vote on it in the end nevertheless played a crucial role. First, in sustaining the group's leadership role on institutional deepening despite its origins in the Spinelli initiative. Second, in facilitating cross-party consensus on the need for endowing the EP with substantial powers and for overcoming blockages in the Council by stopping the unanimity practice. And third, creating a repertoire of constitutional ideas for ECEU reform, which the group, national parties, and EPP-controlled governments could then later draw upon. Leading up to the transformation of the EC into the EU, the EPP group thus consistently played the role of engine in the institutional reform debate, both within European Christian democracy and in the EP in different ways. The origins of the Christian Democrats' drive for European constitutionalization lay in post-war transnational party networking. The national parties in government took the first steps in that direction as over the creation of the ECSC. After the new European institutions were set up, however, the group protected the Christian Democrats' constitutional acquis in times of prevailing intergovernmentalism, loss of power in key member states like Germany, and EC enlargements that temporarily reduced it to second place in the parliament. The group's EC reform activism enhanced its internal cohesion, incentivized cross-party cooperation, and led it to pressurize national parties and governments to support major change in a broadly federal direction. Thus, the group played a leading role in creating and consolidating a strong trajectory for the further deepening of European integration. Let me now come to discussing some aspects of the EPP group's role in policy evolution in the European communities in the period of the Cold War. Its commitment to such a deepening of European integration featured prominently when the EPP prepared its first political program in the run-up to the 1979 elections, which it passed at its Congress in Brussels in March 1978. At its next Congress in February 1979, the EPP also adopted a shorter electoral platform for use in the election campaign, which was generally phrased as a lowest common denominator document. The electoral platform, however, for the first time also included a reference to the social market economy, which had still been contested during the EPP's formation in the mid-1970s. While emphasizing the free responsibility and enterprise of the individual as this model's core element, the document nevertheless at length talked about safeguards, I quote, vigorous regional, structural and social policy, unquote, which would have the objective of eliminating, I quote, regional imbalances, unquote. The European Charter of Employees' Rights aimed at an, I quote, improvement in working conditions, unquote, to result from Europe-wide collective agreements to cover such issues as working hours and equal pay for women and men. And I quote, adequate protection for small and medium-sized undertakings, craftsmen and the middle classes, unquote, and finally support for the, I quote, modern family farm, unquote. The EPP's programmatic demands enshrined fundamental policy objectives and created vectors that basically shaped group preferences until the Lisbon Treaty. Alongside institutional reform demands, these objectives mainly pertain to domestic EC affairs. At this point, foreign policy cooperation in the European communities was limited and purely intergovernmental, of course. Regarding domestic EC matters, the 1979 electoral platform was a bland document designed to please all constituencies and to paper over fundamental differences within and across the group and EPP member parties, especially on socio-economic policy. In fact, the group encompassed a significantly broader ideological range on socioeconomic policy issues than the socialists. Its internal programmatic diversity was down to three main factors. The first consisted of the significant differences in the political economy and socioeconomic policy traditions of the member states. The second factor is intra-party politics, especially the relative influence in the national catch-all parties of representatives close to constituencies like farmers, trade unionists, or industry. As early as 1953-54, when the group in the ECSC's Common Assembly began to debate policy issues in the coal and steel sector, it found a great diversity of views, especially on the questions of cartels and the use of European-level social policy funding for sectoral structural adjustments. Finally, different and changing coalition preferences constituted the third factor. In Germany, the CDU-CSU followed a staunchly anti-socialist course during the Cold War. With the exception of a short period from 66 to 69, it only formed coalitions at the national level, at least with the liberal Free Democrats. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the Italian DC forged the historic compromise with the Italian communists in the 1970s. These different preferences indirectly impacted on ideological positions too, such as when the DC initially refused to join a future EPP in 1975 or to endorse the notion of a social market economy, something that it rightly identified at the time with a strong German ordo-liberal economic policy tradition. When the group as a whole or individual MEPs sought to influence legislative policymaking before the EP acquired formal powers, they could basically use three different routes. The first was working with the Commission at the EC level. Influencing national parties and governments constituted a second avenue. Access via the national route was especially important in policy areas with entrenched national policy communities like agriculture. Lastly, the group and individual MEPs also were able to appeal to the public to encourage the Commission and Council to act at EC level. Thus, when the concerns with transnational air and water pollution became very widespread in the 1960s and early 1970s, the EP used reports and public appeals to get the EC to agree measures in policy fields that were not yet formally covered as such by the EEC Treaty. Arguably, the creation, implementation, and protection of the common agricultural policy initially had the greatest strategic importance for the group after 1958. Embedded in personalist notions of human dignity and healthy rural communities, and based on the interwar experience of many farmers going over to far-right political parties, The Christian Democrats prioritized keeping farmers happy after 1945. Crucially, they constituted a core electoral constituency too, with some 90% of them voting for the CDU-CSU in Germany, for example. The Europeanization of agricultural policy, as originally proposed by Flimelin as French agriculture minister in 1950, was a key building block for the Christian Democrat strategy for the sector. The group strongly supported the notion of the family farm, not just as an economic, but as a social model for the EC and its member states. A powerful narrative that Lücker also introduced into his report for the EP's Agricultural Committee in the early 1960s, although the CAP's funding mechanisms later actually favored, as we know, large-scale farming and multinational food companies. Throughout the formation of the CAP, the majority of the group pushed the Commission and the member states to develop the most comprehensive, protectionist, and also expensive CAP subsidy system that would comply with these policy principles. Despite growing overproduction and rising costs, the group continued to defend the CAP as a cornerstone of the whole construction of the EC, as they called it. When the EPP prepared its political program under the strong influence of Klepsch and the group, it continued to repeat the same basic principles established in the early 1960s. It even justified subsidies for overproduction and exporting inefficiently produced foodstuffs with the need, I quote, to supply the world with agricultural produce, unquote. The EPP demanded to extend the existing market regulations and to increase regional and structural policy spending to support family farms. The group only began to revise its policy on the CAP in the 1980s. This change was due to several factors, including the decline of the farm vote, the CAP's rising costs, as well as demands by agricultural export countries to reduce EC agricultural protectionism in return for the liberalization of trade in goods and services. The group saw EC-level funding for farmers in rural and old industrial regions in transition, not as a waste of taxpayers' money. To the Christian Democrats at the time, this EC-level expenditure constituted the Europeanization of redistributive policies that were well established at national level before, in the form of subsidy policies for farmers and regional policies, such as the Italian Cassa del Mezzogiorno, or the German financial equalization mechanism among the federal states. This was a form of Europeanization, moreover, that they regarded as necessary to counterbalance the effects of economic liberalization in the customs union and as beneficial for enhancing the political legitimacy of the EC. At the national level, the late 1970s and early 1980s saw a shift among EPP parties and governments towards policies of liberalization and deregulation that also affected the EC. Importantly, however, this process impacted the group belatedly, as it initially remained preoccupied with expanding the EC's remit and financial scope for action. The Christian Democrats had advocated the creation of a common market from the start of core Europe integration, both for its expected economic benefits and as a stepping stone to greater political integration. The successful completion of the customs union in 1968 was only one building block of such a common market, however. In the early 1960s, the group made a significant contribution to the debate about competition policy as a second building block. Commissioner Hans von der Groeben acknowledged at the time that the Internal Market Committee's work leading to the Deringer report, another German CDU MEP, influenced the shape of Regulation 17/1962. The third building block in creating a common market was the abolition of non-tariff barriers. Member states sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently used such non-tariff barriers to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. The group collectively played a supportive but not a decisive role in the drive towards the completion of the internal market. However, individual MEPs strongly advocated the liberalization agenda. To do this effectively, the German CDU MEP Karl von Wogau created the Kangaroo Group in 1979 together with the British conservative Basil de Ferranti. Other early members of the Kangaroo Group also had connections to industry or experience with economic policy making. The Christian Democrat Fernand Hermont had been Belgian economics minister, and the Gaullist Christine Scrivener, French consumer affairs minister in the 1970s. Going beyond core issues of economic integration included or in or derived from the existing treaty, the group created space for the policy entrepreneurship of individual MEPs keen to advance a political agenda and get the EC to become active in emerging policy fields. This was the case for what could be called soft foreign policy issues, especially human rights and democracy promotion, which became intimately linked, among other issues, to the suspension of the association agreement with Greece after the military took power there in 1967, for example. Initially focused on domestic EC, not external policy, the environment was another policy field that saw strong policy entrepreneurship by individual MEPs, including from the group, confounding the notion of environmental protection as only a concern of the political left in this period. The European Commission only became actively engaged in environmental policy under the influence of the socialists Spinelli and Mansholt, as well as officials like Petra Kelly, the later co-founder of the German Green Party from 1971 onwards. At this point, however, the European Parliament had already been promoting EC-level environmental protection for some time, pushing the Commission and member states to address their growing concerns. In June 1969, the poisoning of the River Rhine with the pesticide thiodine had raised multiple linked concerns about fishing stock, the livelihood of fishermen, and the safety of citizens swimming in rivers. The Dutch and German Christian Democrats Jacob Boersma and Hans Jahn subsequently worked on reports and EP resolutions on water and air pollution that were passed in 1970 and 72, respectively, the year of the United Nations Stockholm Conference on the Environment. Thus, although the group was ideologically more heterogeneous than the socialists regarding socioeconomic policy, as a whole, as well as individual MEPs, already succeeded in co-shaping ideological vectors and buttressing path for some emerging EC policies before the first direct elections, let alone the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty. The group sought to exercise influence through formal channels like written and oral questions to the Commission, EP initiative reports, and meetings with national parliamentary parties and committees, commissioners, and national governmental policymakers. Informal network-type contacts, largely overlooked by early political science work on European integration until the 1980s, were quite effective in impacting EC-level policymaking. Let me conclude. In my lecture, I've tried to show how the EPP group, with its European ambition, succeeded in playing a central role in EP politics and policymaking from the creation of the European coal and steel community through to the European community's transformation into the EU in the early 1990s. This even at a time after 1975, when it was no longer numerically the largest group. The Christian Democratic Party's early transnational networking and their cooperation in the Common Assembly and in the EP after 1958 created long-term vectors, or what historical institutionists call path dependencies, which shaped its internal constitution and practices, as well as its ideological orientation and programmatic commitments for a long time, and in several ways actually beyond the first direct election. One of the most important structural continuities consisted of the emergence and maintenance of strong ties among Christian Democrats from the 6 ECSC founding member states. From Taviani, Taichen, Fontbentano, and Vigny during the 1950s through to Colombo, Flemelin, Lucas, Bertrand, and others during the 1970s, these Christian Democrats were highly committed to European integration. While pragmatic in adverse circumstances, like de Gaulle's aggressive advocacy of intergovernmentalism during the 1960s, they essentially shared a broadly federalist agenda for the EC. The second most important structural continuity lay in the weakness of Franco-German ties in the group compared to the great importance of this bilateral engine in the Council, which sometimes stuttered badly, but was nevertheless indispensable for European integration. The group was characterized instead by an informal trilateralism of the Italian, German, and Benelux delegations. Then, from the 1970s, the group was increasingly dominated by an Italo-German bilateralism. Their effective cooperation gave stability not just to the group, but also to the EC more generally, with Klepsch often acting as interlocutor between German Chancellor Kohl and the DC leadership. And this, of course, lasted into the early 1990s until the collapse of the DC. Alongside these structural continuities, I've sought to demonstrate how early post-war ideological commitments, which became loosely formalized in the EPP program and platform for the 1979 elections, informed the group's European ambitions and created strong long-term vectors for its political and policy preferences. This concerned, most importantly, the group's overriding commitment to the EC's constitutionalization and the normalization of the EP as a federal-level parliament with full budgetary and legislative powers. Additionally, the group was also committed from the start of European integration to the creation of a common market with associated policies like competition and monetary cooperation, economic liberalization that had to be combined with a full or partial Europeanization of redistributive welfare policies, however, especially for agriculture, but also for rural and old industrial regions in the form of structural funds and the new regional policy in the 1970s. During the 40 years from the creation of the ECSC to the EC's transformation into the EU in the early 1990s, the group was able to influence not just EP politics and policy making, but also the development of the EC in ways that have largely been overlooked in the older political science literature, which was still focused on explaining formal institutions and their powers. What the EP lacked in formal powers, the group and individual MEPs sought to compensate as much as possible through informal mechanisms of networking with the national parties and parliamentary parties, the Christian Democratic commissioners and Christian Democrat-led governments, as well as occasionally non-governmental organizations. It has hopefully become clear that the group to varying extents fulfilled the system building and policy-making functions. They contributed core ideas to the process of EC constitutionalization in a federal direction. They also sought to shape opinion formation and policy-making not just in the EP, but in the EC system more generally. Not surprisingly, therefore, when the Cold War ended, for the European People's Party group in the parliament, this momentous change marked a kind of end of history, to paraphrase Francis Fukuyama. Its values of democracy, human rights, social market economy, and European integration appear to have prevailed for good, not just over communism, but any form of socialism too. The resulting enthusiasm for the EPP and the group's fast enlargement and for deepening the EU quickly based on existing federalist templates posed great challenges, however, that the alliance of center-right parties did not foresee and that were perhaps not foreseeable in this form at the time. The first of these concerned the EPP's ability to absorb many more new parties during the EU's northern and eastern enlargements. The ambition to socialize new East Central and Southeastern European parties into the post-war Christian democratic consensus has proved to be exceptionally difficult, and it has created growing internal strife leading up to the eventual self-exclusion of the Hungarian Fidesz from the group earlier this year and beyond. The second challenge concerned the increasingly pervasive discourse about the EC's democratic deficit from the 1970s onwards. This was a discourse that, ironically, the group had fostered in order to strengthen its claim to more powers for the European Parliament as apparently the only remedy to this fundamental problem. After the end of the Cold War and the Maastricht Treaty, however, populist parties on the right and left of the spectrum increasingly radicalized this democratic deficit discourse to discredit long-standing group ambitions for the EU, as well as the entire European project. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wolfram, very much for your very, very interesting synthesis and interpretation of the role of the PPA group in the European Parliament. I have perceived many of the suggestions that may come for our young scholars here and their research projects. I mentioned only the relation you mentioned between the translational network and the domestic policy for every one of the members that are involved in the group, the problems of the redistributive policy, that is one of the subjects we have in mind here, modernization in general, the problem in human rights and democracy in foreign policy, that is another topic we have here. So I think there is much food for discussion and debate. We have an opportunity to put in direct contact these young scholars with you. So the floor is to them now. I would ask them to start a dialogue with you about these topics with their questions or comments. So, please. Nobody? Please tell your name.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Paolo Bozzi. I work in Berlin and I work on actually economic history of taxation. But my question, at least for now, would be more like the role of this group on national groups. So, to my understanding, at least also from your presentation as well, it looked a bit like basically like a room for compensation between the national groups that just met, and they tried to find some common elements, which was quite hard. As you said, like each country has some sort of different economic and structural characteristics that were not that easy to integrate. So my question is, to which extent this cooperation at the European level, especially after 1979, as you said, influenced the national parties? We know that also like Christian democracy like in the 80s was a bit different from the Christian democracy in the 60s. So maybe some like the strong ideas were maybe not there anymore and the parties were kind of changing. But still, can we notice some sort of like basically trickling down from the European level to the national level? And maybe an example, I don't know, could it be on economic policy or like European integration, but from the economic point of view? I think again about taxation, that's a bit early, that's the 60s. But we have, at the end of the 60s, we have the introduction of VAT and like basically the restructuring of the European tax systems. And to which extent that was also a result of cooperation between the European level again and the parties. For example, in Italy, was the Christian democracy to at least coordinate this reform, did not organize that on their own. And it's kind of similar in Germany, I think. So this kind of like a way back from the European level to the national one. Hope it was clear. Thank you.
Please. Wolfram, did you hear clearly?
Do you want to collect questions or you want me to respond?
I would prefer to have one answer for every question if possible. So.
Okay, well, I don't have a good answer because, to be perfectly honest, our research and our book focused on the European level cooperation. And I think what you've raised there is a really important question that requires much more research by people like you, Paolo, on the question of the relationship between the European level and the national level at the level of the political parties and the national groups. I think the problem with the direct election in 1979 actually was the end of the dual mandate. So in a sense, this form of parliamentarization of the European level by strengthening the European Parliament and trying to give the European Parliament more legitimacy through the direct elections meant that previous ties, which were of course very close as a result of the dual mandate between the European level MEPs who were also national level MPs, were cut. And so we have from then onwards a greater delineation of these two parliamentary fields at the European level and at the national level. And unintended consequences, because the objective, of course, of having the European Parliament directly elected was not to disassociate it from the national parliaments, but rather to strengthen the parliamentary dimension at the European level. But the actual practical effect was to some extent that it became more difficult for the MEPs who were now only, in inverted commas, working in Brussels and Strasbourg and no longer in Paris and Rome and Bonn, etc. The practical effect was that there was far less contact between the European and the national level, and the MEPs needed to focus far more on their work in Strasbourg or Brussels to have an effect there. And so, as I've said, I think particularly in the case of political parties where political careers developed, which became exclusively European for many, as in the case of many of the German Christian Democrats I mentioned, for example, this created difficulties of cooperation. So they, of course, mainly focused in Brussels and Strasbourg on those policy fields for which the European communities had competence, or for which they were working towards the European communities acquiring some form of competence, as in the case of environmental pollution as a transnational problem, which I mentioned, for example. So taxation being firmly outside of the competence of the European communities, European Union, I don't see, from my knowledge of the sources at the European level, that there was much discussion about this. In terms of EC level politics and policy making, what I think would be interesting for you, but I think is also going to be exceptionally difficult to reconstruct on the basis of the sources that we still have, because it will have been very informal, is the question to what extent the European level cooperation in the Parliament might have contributed, and I think that's the question you are asking me, to some kind of transfer of policy ideas or practices in policy fields like taxation, which were still completely national and where there was no EC competence. But nevertheless, of course, these politicians had their own national experiences and were steeped to some extent in national debates about tax reform. And so they might have discussed these things on the side, but they were certainly not their main preoccupation as they were working in Brussels and Strasbourg. Now, I can't go into the details of the institutional aspect of the question of the cooperation between the European and the national level, but this was very differently managed by the different political parties in terms of, for example, how MEPs were allowed to be present or were encouraged to be present at meetings of the national parliamentary groups, but this of course became increasingly impractical as they had to devote more time to actually being in Brussels and Strasbourg. And there were different mechanisms also in terms of the parliamentary committee work at the national level, which also to some extent co-opted MEPs or invited them to meetings in order to retain connections between the European and the national level. Now, just one last, I don't want to go on for too long, but one last comment on this. I have recently looked in a very, very contemporary manner, this is not published yet, but hopefully will be published soon, at what the EPP group is doing now, because now the EPP group is really very, very concerned about the divergence of institutional and informal forms of cooperation at the European level and at the national level. And this is not just got to do with Fidesz. And it has, as a result, this was 5 years ago, instituted what it calls an Erasmus program to socialize MPs from the national capitals, from its own sister parties or member parties, into European ways of thinking, or even just providing them with some basic understanding of how the European Union works. So I think this question of the relationship between the European level and the national level at the level of the groups and the parliaments is something that has become an even greater issue or problem nowadays in times of some degree of renationalization and intergovernmental policy making compared to the 1980s or 1990s particularly. So to cut a long story short, Paola, I don't really have an answer for you, but I think this question of how this European level cooperation in the group or in the EPP was also a platform for discussing national policy issues and maybe facilitated policy, what political scientists would call policy learning, or maybe transfer of political ideas and practices, is something that I think is eminently important. So I would encourage you to look into this, but it may be very difficult to reconstruct this on the basis of the sources that we have from this time.
Thank you. So, Tiziano, please.
During your lecture, you have quoted more than once the role played by the European Popular Party, especially in the regarding the links between the farm trade unions with the parties around Europe, or the importance which the party played on the farm and agricultural policies. I would like to ask if there was an awareness, a shared awareness from these networks about the changes that this would brought to the values of the pre-capitalistic world, which we had at the beginning of the European integration until the arrival and the beginning of a different world, of the industrial world around Europe.
I'm sorry, I haven't quite understood what you mean by changes. You mean the common agricultural policy, particularly how it would impact on values, or what kinds of values?
Exactly. If there was an awareness by these Christian democratic networks about the fact that these changes and all the challenges that the farm and agricultural policies, which were one of the cause of the European integration, would have brought to the so-called Christian civilization in Europe, which was one of the issues at that time.
Okay. No, I'm not sure I can give a convincing answer to this, but I will try to come up with an attempt to answer the question. Now, I think the focus in the post-war period was very much on making sure that farmers' income would not lag behind significantly that of workers in industry particularly. So here we have, of course, a concern in a period when we moved to full employment across the European Economic Community in the mid-1950s, with the exception of southern Italy, of course, where you still have a high unemployment and northwards migration to address that issue. But otherwise, we have more or less full employment. And then also a significant rise in workers' income. And I think the concern of the Christian Democratic parties, broadly speaking, was that farmers' income shouldn't lag behind, and that it should remain possible for them to work on this family farm that was, of course, to some extent imagined rather than a reality necessarily in economic terms. And of course, came under pressure in the 60s and 70s from restructuring and the need to create larger farms and to enhance efficiency and so on. So what I find interesting is that the preoccupation is indeed, political preoccupation is in a sense, of course, electoral in terms of these people, or many of these people are voting for us, so we need to support them. But it's also historical in the sense that these farmers were lost to these totalitarian, fascist and Nazi ideologies, many of them in the 1930s. And so to prevent this, it needs to be there needs to be some kind of Europeanization of agricultural policy in order to stabilize farm income and allow farmers to stay on their farms and also to become socialized, if you want, into the parliamentary regimes of the post-war period, as well as European integration, which is now providing them with this kind of European welfare system, the common agricultural policy system as a kind of welfare system, as Ann-Christina Kulutzen has conceptualized in her book on the common agricultural policy, was, I think, the main preoccupation. Now, what I think these people, even if they often had links to the farming community or came from farms, did not anticipate so much in the 50s and early 1960s, when then the common agricultural policy was being developed, was the huge technological progress in terms of mechanization and in terms of increased use of fertilizers and pesticides and so on in farming, let alone the broader international trade issues, which then led to a collision of the European communities, of course, with export countries like Canada or Australia or Argentina, etc., which were then in the 1980s organized in the Cairns Group. So these kinds of fundamental structural changes, both in the domestic farm economies and in Europe and in the international trade connections and regimes, was something that I think Christian Democrats did not focus on or didn't anticipate. And these then probably, if I've understood you correctly, led to significant changes or fundamental changes in the way in which the entire farming regime became restructured in the 70s and 80s. Now, the European Commission actually more or less desired these changes in order to make farming more efficient, because their focus was very heavily on efficiency gains. And so they were quite keen on using the Common Agricultural Policy in order to facilitate this kind of European transformation of farming into a kind of industry, what was later was actually called an industry. Whereas this Christian Democrats in the European People's Party group or the Christian Democratic group were much more keen on the social perspective, on using this Europeanized subsidy system in order to maintain the existing social structure, as well as perhaps rural and traditional values that you've referred to. So this was a clash that I don't think they quite anticipated, and that only became much clearer in the 1970s crisis of the Common Agricultural Policy.
Well, more questions?
Thank you.
You mentioned the European networks that the Christian Democrats established during the Cold War. I was wondering if you have found some information or evidence about a common policy designed to establish networks with Latin American or other foreign Christian Democratic groups. I know for a fact that there were many Christian Democrats from Latin American countries that were political exiles during the dictatorships that were hosted in Europe by other Christian Democrat networks. So I was wondering if the Parliament and the Christian Democratic parties design a common policy in order to host those groups with a quota system or a scholarship system, for instance, during the Cold War.
There is, can you just tell me, sorry, who you are? Because you're all hidden by masks and I may know you, but could you just tell me who you are?
Sorry, I didn't understand your question.
Could you just tell me who you are, because everyone else introduced themselves?
Yeah, my name is Rafael Pedamonte. I'm working in the University of Poitiers.
Yeah, thank you for telling me that. Yes, if I may, perhaps I can draw attention to a forthcoming book in the CIVITAS series, where Piotr Kozicki and I are actually, as editors, are actually looking at the question of Christian democratic exile. And this includes a section with 2 articles, which you may find useful if you're interested in this, by a French colleague and a colleague from Chile, who look at the particular case of the Chilean exile in Europe, in brackets, and in North America in the period after the Pinochet coup of 1973. So this is, I know that Piotr is also interested in this more from a North, because it's based in North America, from a North American perspective as well, because of course there were also Christian Democrats from Latin America, went to North America as well, and were supported by Catholic networks there. So what we find through these 2 chapters is that there was a large degree there were very many different initiatives that were taken at different levels. But the European People's Party group in the Parliament did not play a significant role in terms of actually accommodating, because it didn't see that as its own primary purpose in terms of accommodating individuals and providing them with scholarships and allowing them to study at university and so on. I think the national level parties and associated foundations in particular did a lot of work in that direction in different, and you will find references in these 2 chapters to that, the Italian party particularly, and associated foundations in the Netherlands. That was the case, and to some extent there was also cross-party, the German Adenauer Foundation, of course, because it had a lot of funding for this sort of activity, also provided quite a lot of funding. Where these exiles went depended a little bit on if they had other language skills other than Spanish, or for example, and whether they had already had prior political contacts and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very interesting field, and a lot more research can be done on this. The group focused primarily on European contacts to begin with, because of its limited resources and in terms of finances and time. So they were focused in the 1970s, not so much on Latin America, but on Spain and Portugal, particularly in terms of creating networks with Christian Democrats there, which were already part of, in terms of being in exile, were already part, of course, of the transnational networks, as in the case of Spain, or were then becoming incorporated into these existing transnational networks and the EUCD and then the EPP later in the case of Portugal. So there was quite a lot of extensive work also by the EPP group in terms of travel to Spain and Portugal in 1974-75 in order to identify partners in the very fast shifting political environment in this transition period and in the creation of new political parties there, particularly in Portugal, where there wasn't any presidents during the Salazar regime. So that was the primary focus of the group. And then there were contacts that the group had also via the delegations that the European Parliament has with other parliamentary political systems. So of course there are delegations with Latin American countries, and they existed at the cross-party level. So there we have the group's activities, but also to some extent the parliament's activities with parliaments where they still exist in a meaningful way in the period before, or again, in the transition back to democracy in the late 1980s in Latin American countries. But I think the national level parties and particularly associated foundations did far more in terms of accommodating individual exiles from Latin America in Europe in this period of the 70s and 80s.
Thank you so much.
Professor Christians?
Thank you, Professor Kaiser. I'm Kim Christians. I'm the director of CADOC and the steering board member of CIVITAS. I have a question which is more relating to methodology. So because the CIVITAS Research Academy is also about sources and methodologies. And I was wondering, could you give some perspectives on the sources and the methodological concepts you are working with or on? You talked about continuities. You also talked about relationships between individual members within the People's Party. Could you give some, according to you, innovative source materials, approaches, which makes this history of the European People's Party for you interesting, both from maybe a more personal perspective as well from a more general perspective. And I'm very curious to learn about this based on your own experience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I should say that this book that we published in 2020 actually resulted from an initiative by the European People's Party group in the European Parliament. So there were some people in the group, in the group's administration, effectively, who were keen on a more academic approach, if you like, to understanding the history of the EPP group than what had been published before. For example, Pascal Fontaine, who worked for the group for a very long time, published a book about it, I think in 2009, which, however, is less an academic approach to the topic rather than a kind of mix of an autobiography and writing from own experience about working for the EPP group for decades, own experience with the group of the work. So they were actually very keen, and I found that really interesting, in historical, more academic work on the EPP group being undertaken by a set of academics. And the process between 2017 or 18, if I remember correctly, or 17 probably, and 2020, during which we did the research for the group, and also eventually coordinated this integrated monograph, which consists of 5 chapters which cover different aspects, but there was a high degree of cooperation across the different chapters. And by the way, with a lot of very useful help by Jacopo Cellini, who's also, I think, listening in today from outside of Rome. We put together this in response to this call from the EPP group. And they were all, of course, authors with various backgrounds that had already published something on something related to party cooperation or the EPP group, etc., in the European context. So in this sense, it wasn't originally our idea, but I became really interested in the particular role of the group for a number of reasons. First of all, because I think too much perhaps has already been done, including by myself, on networks at the level of the European level parties, which was important, I think, in the early post-war period, but became much less efficient and less important in the 1960s and 70s. So I think this particular aspect struck me as interesting and important, particularly for the period of before and after the direct elections. Then, of course, the group said, well, if you are prepared to write this history of the EPP group, then we will make all of our archival sources available to you, and also make these archival sources available to you without imposing the 30-year rule. So until then, and I don't know the intricate details, and Sir Küsters may know more about this, until some time ago, all of the sources of the EPP and the EPP group went to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation's archives in St. Augustine, but of course they also kept a lot of stuff in Brussels, and that stuff that was still in Brussels, they said they would make accessible to us, and it's now being made accessible. Maybe a lot of it is already accessible. I haven't checked recently via the European University Institute's Historical Archive of the European Union in Florence. Is also online. So there's a process of digitization, and that's perhaps another important point. Of course, as historians, we need to be interested in the easy accessibility of sources, and I think the policy of digitization of materials that the EPP group has transferred or made accessible to the European University Institute is something that I think is very useful in terms of facilitating access also by the researchers who are in the room now in Rome, who might be interested in using some of this material. Now, what we nevertheless, and that's not surprising, of course, found difficult is that political groups, unlike state actors like ministries, for example, political groups in the parliament don't have any rules imposed on them, and the European Parliament has no means of imposing any rules on its groups in the parliament in terms of what sources they need to archive. So this is completely haphazard, and I think that's also important to know, and makes our lives as historians very difficult, of course. Now, the EPP group is the only group in the European Parliament to employ someone who actually has responsibility for keeping some of the sources, sifting through the material and deciding what sources are to be kept for later and how they are to be preserved. And even that was done in a way that was not exceptionally professional. So that's not even a person who is an archivist by learning. So none of the other groups in the European Parliament even has someone with responsibility for this. So a lot of stuff habitually gets thrown away when people think it's no longer useful or there's no longer enough space in their office, etc., etc. That's also something we as historians perhaps should be concerned about, and make sure that there's a better and more systematic preservation of sources from the European Parliament. Then when you look at the actual sources that have been preserved, of course, there's a very great divergence in terms of the quality. There are, of course, some verbatim reports of meetings, but sometimes we only have summaries of meeting conclusions, for example. So you then need to go beyond the materials of the EPP group and look at private sources, for example, of the MEPs, private papers that some of the MEPs have left behind. And then, of course, there are some of these private papers you have in the Istituto Sturzo for some of the Italian DG members of the European Parliament. And similarly, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation archives in St. Augustine have them for some German members of the European Parliament. And it's definitely important to go beyond these kinds of immediate formal sources of the group in order to reconstruct the internal dynamics, the personal relationships, etc. And also to look at things like private letters and so on, and not just the formal group documents, conclusions of meetings, etc., etc. The particular question you also asked, that's the last point I'm going to make here, also asked me about the question of continuities. The group was primarily interested in the period since the direct election of the European Parliament. And we all thought that this was really interesting because they wanted to construct their own chronology, which was basically everything changed in 1979 when we became directly elected. And having worked on the period before 1979, my feeling was that that was probably, intuitively, was probably nonsense. And so we insisted that there should be a chapter which would look at the period before 79 and go into the 1980s and stop in the early 1990s. And that the other 4 chapters, which basically cover the period since 1979, would also look back to the period before 1979 and relate to my chapter in the book, which covers this earlier period. So that we were able to show in this way that 1979 in some ways, of course, did create a rupture, for example, the end of the dual mandate, greater professionalization of the groups, the far more employment of policy officers, etc., etc. That in many other ways, particularly in terms of the key guiding policy ideas and preferences, there was also a high level of continuity across the pre-1979 and the post-1979 period. So I'm sure I haven't answered all of your questions, but I hope I've answered some. And I think it's really important for the PhD students and also for early postdocs, etc., to be aware of the need when you do this kind of European or multi-level work across the European and the national level to go to many different sources and not to rely too much on one particular set of sources as those of the EPP group, which are accessible in St. Augustine and in Florence nowadays.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfram. I think we have still 5 minutes. I have a person.
Mr. President, may I add one sentence?
Yes, Hans. This is Professor Kusters from Germany, former president of CIVITAS. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoy to participate in this conference, of course. Let me add one sentence, what Wolfram Kaiser mentioned. Indeed, in St. Augustine, the archives are all the materials of the group available completely, so far as I know. And there is a 20 years limit of these materials coming in from Brussels, but I know there were a lot of digitalization within the group, and they try to manage it in Brussels for several years. And in so far, some students being interested in these materials have also to contact the group itself to ask for some material there, of course. I think it's very important to have a look in other papers of members of the European Parliament. I know there are a lot of private papers available as well, and these materials, especially of Hans-Gert Pöttering, of course, are also available at the archive in St. Augustine. That's the one point. The second point, it's much more questions concerning the thesis of Wolfram Kaiser. Perhaps it is possible to point out some aspects on the unsolved relationship between the Christian democratic parties and the EPP group on the one hand, and the conservatives on the other hand. It's a very important question, and I hope that it's possible for you to point it out in a certain way in how far it has an influence on the development of the EPP group. Thank you.
Wolfram, did you hear?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course, this was a big question, and of course created quite some tension within the EPP group, because the Belgian Italian parties particularly, which were more to the center left of the political spectrum, were quite reluctant to cooperate more closely with the British Conservatives in particular, which they indeed saw as a conservative and not a Christian democratic party. And of course the CDU-CSU members particularly were keen on some kind of rapprochement with this or the political party or the Danish Conservatives, for example. Now, I think what is really important is that those who pushed for the creation of the EPP in the first place, when it was as a party, when it was created in 1976, and that was, of course, particularly Kohl and the German CDU, and that they were really keen on a greater degree of cooperation with the Conservatives in the parliament, and eventually probably the creation of some kind of integrated group. Now, the British Conservatives, of course, this was a complex construction, in the end became associated with the EPP in one common parliamentary group in the early 1990s, and this lasted until 2009. What I think is really important is that the overriding objective of the group and the group leadership, especially Klepsch, in cooperating with Kohl in this period of the 1990s, was to make the EPP group somehow the largest political group and the most influential political group in the parliament again. And for this, they thought, because of the enlargements and the impact of the enlargements and the structure of the political party systems in these countries like the United Kingdom or Denmark or Spain, that it would be really impossible to do that without incorporating some of these somewhat more conservative or much more conservative parties like the British Conservatives or the Partito Popular or the Alianza before Popular in Spain into the EPP and the EPP group. So I think the EPP group played an important role here because it was very keen on maximizing its own numerical strength and overtaking the socialists again to become the largest political group in the parliament. Now, there was this kind of power logic and dynamic was of overriding importance and made it easier to enlarge the group than it made it, than to enlarge the EPP, because the ideological conflicts or differences at the level of the EPP seem to be more important, because the EPP as a political party, a transnational political party, of course, didn't have any direct possibility to influence legislation, as of course the EPP group had after the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty in the European Parliament. So the power logic for the EPP group was absolutely of overriding importance in terms of fostering this rapprochement with this deal with the British Conservatives, the incorporation of the Partito Popular in the early 1990s as well, etc. Now, the question that wasn't discussed in the 1980s in the group is what kind of impact will this eventually have on our own ideological internal cohesion? And I think that question, of course, has come back to hurt the EPP group, arguably in the 2010s and still up to the present day, because it has become far more heterogeneous. And it's not just the Central Southeastern European parties from countries like Hungary until earlier this year, or Slovenia or Bulgaria, for example, which completely are not aligned to the West European post-war consensus on the constitutional and desirable constitutional nature of the European Union at all. Now, this wasn't a problem even with the British Conservatives in the early 1990s or the Partito Popular. So this heterogeneity has increased massively. And now, of course, the EPP is still the largest group in the European Parliament and still core to politics and policymaking in the Parliament, but it finds it far more difficult to achieve sufficient internal agreement to actually exercise this role effectively. And that was something that I don't think anyone really anticipated, wasn't really discussed at all as a prospective problem in the future in the 1980s or the early 1990s.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, it is 11:02, so have we passed the time we have scheduled for discussion? It was a very good work in group, seminar work as we imagined it had to be. So thank you to everybody. Thank you, Professor Kaiser, for your lecture today. Thank you, everybody, for questions and problems. Thank you, Professor Kusters, for his participation. And we will have a short break, and at 11:15 we will have the second keynote speech by Professor Pombeni.